Welcome to Plus One Forward, the podcast powered by the apocalypse, where we talk about tabletop role-playing games using or inspired by the Apocalypse engine. I'm your co-MC Rich.
And I'm your co-MC Rach.
And today, quite a bit after the summer has ended, we are going to do the wrap-up of our Firebrands Summer Series. Firebrands, what have we learned?
It's summer somewhere, maybe. Is it like summer in the southern hemisphere? I'm not quite sure how that works.
I think yes, it's the Australian Summer Series now. It's summer all the time.
Yes, what have we learned from our adventures exploring Firebrands? Well, I could start with what my first impressions were.
Yeah.
I was really excited for this summer series because Firebrands is really nostalgic for me, which for people who are new to Firebrands, that might be a weird take. But I believe Firebrands first came out to the wider public around the first time I went to my very first indie RPG-focused convention in the States. In 2016, it was JiffyCon. I bought a Firebrands booklet set that I think was overstock left over from PAX East. Think PAX East 2016. I might be wrong with this. I tried to collaborate. I bought a lot of games that weekend because shipping to Canada, even back then, was terrible. And this was an opportunity to buy all the games I wanted, toss them in the car. Firebrands was one of those. And it always has had a special place in my heart. I used to run Firebrands a lot pre-pandemic during monthly meetups in Toronto. But I guess when I'm saying Firebrands games, I really mean games created by the bakers, because I didn't realize how many Firebrand hacks exist on the market till we sat down to do this summer series. Played a lot of Dreaming Avalon. I've played a lot of Firebrands, but it's expanded beyond what I realized.
Far, far beyond.
What was your first experience with Firebrands?
Well, I had a different entry than yours. My first foray into Firebrands was at Camp Nerdly a number of years ago. See, Camp Nerdly is this idyllic place, Prince William Forest Park in Virginia, where people all come together, all indie, nerdy, hippy-dippy folks get together at this gigantic camp, and at each time slot, a number of folks will get up and pitch the game they would like to facilitate or GM, and folks will go line up with that person who's pitched, and then everyone splits off to different cabins and plays for that time slot. And one camper pitched The King is Dead and Mobile Frame Zero Firebrands. I was very excited to give it a shot. I had heard. I'm also kind of in on Baker's PbtA-ness. When the dozen or so of us went to the assigned gaming cabin to play, we broke into small groups to play either Mobile Frame Zero Firebrands or The King is Dead, and knowing nothing about The King is Dead, in fact, I didn't know it existed until the camper who pitched it said The King is Dead, I thought, I'll go with the one I've heard of. I'd seen pictures of the cover. The facilitator handed out these little pamphlet-y books and explained, I'm paraphrasing, all you need to play is in here. I'm going to go play King is Dead with these people. Toodles.
Oh no!
Yeah.
That's the worst!
Yeah, so we stumbled through a few of the mini games. We struggled to understand the order of things. I felt like I enjoyed a few moments once I got over the frustration of feeling cast out into the void. And that was, mostly on me. I see now, especially after having interviewed the bakers to kick off this series, that this really is supposed to be everything you need. But it was just an awkward experience for me. And I spent a lot of times sitting on a cabin bench being mad about it.
I am, because, radio makes for great video. I am cringing inside as someone who used to organize gaming conventions, who has talked at length about the double-edged sword that is GM-less games in a convention setting, because if you're bringing that to the table, you are supposed to basically be the GM and make it go. I'm so sorry you were abandoned like that.
I think if any one of the group of us who were playing Mobile Frame Zero Firebrands had played it before, it would have been a whole lot less clunky. But unfortunately, we were all completely unaware of what the heck we were supposed to be doing, and also really confused by the options and the questions and the okay, what order do these go in, and all of those things that I've asked about during the summer series. After that point, I honestly avoided Firebrands games until last year, and the Camp Nerdly thing was, I want to say 2017-ish. So it had been quite a while since that experience. But David Morrison offered to facilitate once more Into the Void. And that pitch alone pulled me in. The idea of a Mass Effect 2 meets Picard. Yes, please. And I also was super excited about the fact that it had mechanics to resolve tense situations that wasn't just a coin flip. So I was excited to play that, and I had a really good time. David played the captain. Yay, I didn't have to. And it was super fun. Subsequent Firebrands experiences have all happened to me this summer for the express purpose of trying to get more experience with it. I facilitated Thy Words Inspire Thespians with the group here in Minnesota in the Twin Cities, and we also played Superstars Racing Icons, the +1 forward home game, tried a couple sessions of Mobile Frame Zero Firebrands, and we did a one-shot of Miss Bernberg's as well. I will talk a little bit more about this later, but I slipped in one of the mini games into my, I've talked about it a number of times, long-running play-by-post game of Urban Shadows with my buddy Heidi. So we did play through one of those mini games in a play-by-post medium, and that was interesting. But scheduling snafus prevented a bunch of other sessions from happening. I'm embarrassed to admit that I was the least successful playing the games featured during the summer series. I scheduled a 2-shot of Aces in Space Firebrands because once I heard that even existed, I had to play it. But that's not coming up until this weekend. So my experience with Firebrands is still pretty small, unfortunately.
And we'll get back to this later. Mine was and still is a little bit rusty, just because of how I encountered Firebrands and kind of how my mind filters it as more of a physical in-person game, which, as you know, the state of things in the world is not what it was back when Firebrands was originally created.
Fair indeed. It is not the same. All right, Rach, talk to me. What aspect of Firebrands captured your imagination the most?
What captured my imagination with Firebrands is an aspect of the game that is not very imaginative at all, which is how structured it is. It feels like, from my perspective, that Firebrands is almost a reaction to an idea in gaming that's sometimes called emergent play. In tabletop RPGs, emergent play often refers to a game with very little mechanics, out of which a complex story is expected to eventually develop in the empty spaces the game provides. Very common in indie games, exists in other PbtA-ish places. For listeners who have been around since their 2020 Summer Series featuring Belonging Outside Belonging, emergent play can also be used exactly the same as idle dreaming. So that spitball-y brainstorming phase out of which we realize how the pieces of the game click together, and then a story spirals out beyond our imagination or the capabilities of one person through, I don't know, the magic of emergent play. Well, I have very complicated feelings on this, as implied by me referencing that I have brought GM less inferior games to convention tables because it doesn't work like this. Very rarely does it work as intended, emergent play, especially in a con environment. Oh my gosh. Well, idle dreaming is incredibly abstract and free form. Firebrands gives a lot of structure and guidance to what scenes could happen in a game's story via the minigames. Each minigame lays out what the scene's about, who's in the scene, what setup needs to be done to get that scene to the table, as it were, and how players who are not immediately in that scene can still engage with the story that's going on, either by voting mechanics or asking questions, or even stepping aside to play solitaire if there's nothing that's really compelling you of the ongoing scene. This streamlines the expectations for players who might be newer to tabletop RPGs or might be just newer to GM-less games, and bypasses situations such as another player having to sit in a quasi-GM position to set up a situation the other players really want, or have to end up defaulting into playing NPCs that the other PCs want to see on screen a lot, or players not having anything to do, and so they pull out their phones and check what's on social media until they're able to play again. Granted, the trade-off to this very structured approach in gameplay ends up doing very peculiar things to the narrative flow. While the content of scenes is fixed, the connective tissue, how we get from scene A to scene B, is loose, if it even exists at all.
Yeah. For me, I was fascinated with the Baker's goal of making a very accessible PbtA game, a kind of party game, if you will. The structure with lightning fast character creation, mini games with simple rules, suggested questions and reactions, as well as, my favorite part, a defined ending point. Like, you go this many times and then this mini game will end. I really love that. All of that bundled together in a travel-sized book. It's exciting to feel like this is a kind of game that I might share with some work friends at a gathering, or some old school buddies when I circle back home to visit. Non-gamers, but folks who might like a party game at, a party where people get together and face-to-face thing.
Do people still have those?
Well,
is this an American thing?
I'm originally from the American South, so if I return home, they haven't worn masks in a year. So yes, it's still a thing. Also, the idea of expanding a move into a structure that allows several turns is super interesting. There are several times that I saw a minigame that I desperately wanted to steal and throw into other RPGs, even non-PbtA RPGs, and that's pretty cool.
There's some great mini games. I always like citing Stealing Time Away as sort of a playful, sexually charged game if you're into bringing that sort of play to your table. It's not explicit. It's very flirty.
Yes. Oh, you just reminded me, because you suggested Stealing Time Together to me when I was running we're now on to Stonetop, but we were in Urban Shadows for one period game with my wife, and you suggested that, and we gave it a shot, and that was fun. I guess that was in that between time. I'd forgotten about that completely until you just mentioned that you suggest that. Yeah, that's a good one. I really like that.
On the flip side of this conversation, though, Rich, what aspects of Firebrands did you find underwhelming?
So the underwhelming parts for me is that I felt like Firebrands solves for a problem by creating a new, for me, problem. It's welcoming because anyone can pick a minigame, whatever game they want, when it's their turn. But it also, when I played it, it left me scrambling to try to create some kind of coherent narrative in my head, to have a story arc to hang on for my character. And maybe I didn't ask the question clearly, or maybe I still don't understand the answer, But I felt like in our opening episode for this summer series, I asked the bakers, how do you reconcile this? And it felt like my desire for a character arc wasn't something that they agreed should even be a goal for me when participating in Firebrands. And if that's what they meant, and that's what it sounded like, that's kind of disappointing. It makes me feel like this game should be viewed as something to just pick up and play for a night without worrying about it so much. That sounds healthy, right? I get it. It's all well and good. But it's so very different from my own expectations when I come into a tabletop role-playing game. It's why I try to carve time for a tabletop role-playing game versus a board game. And the idea of approaching what ostensibly is an RPG experience with a board game mindset is still something I just haven't reconciled. I'm bad at one-shots. I just am. And that's a me thing.
I think that's a really good observation because there's no tools in Firebrands for your characters to advance.
Mm-hmm.
When I say tools, there's like no level up mechanic, but also nothing that drives gaining experience. I have run games that have something for the players to pursue. I'm thinking specifically of Golden Sky Stories, which is not a PbtA game or a Firebrands game, but it handles experience in a different way where you have a static character sheet, but you're always building and developing your relationships. That's the thing you pursue. It doesn't necessarily improve your character per se, but nothing like that exists in Firebrands. It's just, here's a book, here's a couple descriptions of your character. Now walk through the story that you're going to story jam, as it were, with your other players. But to what end goal? There's nothing to achieve.
Right.
Be that mechanical or even sitting down and learning more about your character and making changes to your character sheet as the sessions progress.
That's interesting because it pairs with the other part about my, granted, limited experience with Firebrands that I found underwhelming is the very prescriptive answers to questions. And the sometimes obtuse questions or situations and how assumptive they are. At some points, I found myself intrigued with it. Like, oh, I didn't imagine that my mobile frame pilot would be the kind of character to make a social gaffe, but why not? That's interesting. Let's see how that changes this situation and also learn about this other person's view of their character and how they react to it. Do they save me? Do they hang me out to dry? But there were many other times that I found myself looking over the possible reactions to a situation and thinking, okay, none of these work. None of these work unless I push my character into a new space. And then I've got to scaffold up this mental backstory that doesn't jive with what I thought was happening just seconds ago. Now I have to change it on the fly. And that's something that a lot of designers and players will say kind of falls away with time as you play more and more Firebrands games. That's what they said. Just keep going and then you get the pattern of the mini games and it becomes more fluent for you. But like I said at the top, I didn't get to play mini this summer. So I never found that happy place where I could adjust the minigame on the fly without feeling like I was cheating or not true to, I came here to play this game. It's just a one shot. And to just go, no, I don't like any of these. I'm going to come up with my own thing. I'm sure I could do that. I'm sure no one would say that's bad. But I was trying to experience it based on its own merits, based on what I see on the page. And I never found that spot where I felt comfortable.
It's an interesting thought, especially if you were to compare the 3 summer series and how they handle failure, because I think my main takeaway based on what you're saying is there's almost a prescriptive quality to failure in Firebrands, which is you're in a bad situation and all of these choices stink. And there's none that's really feels in character for your character, as opposed to belonging outside belonging, where failure is on you to come up with a failure that makes sense to harm your character in order for them to succeed later on, or Forged in the Dark, which is a little bit closer to how we see failure in Powered by the Apocalypse, which is I rolled dice and the dice came up bad. All right, now I know I got a bad result. What does that look like between you, the player, and the MC? As opposed to, I'm in a bad situation and all these answers aren't great. I don't have the freedom to decide the way I fail.
Right. What aspects of Firebrands did you find underwhelming?
I found as we dug through these Firebrand hacks that some games were less elaborately hacked out of Firebrands than others. This isn't a unique feature with PbtA games, and I know there is a dangerous trap where we can go in a whole discourse of, is a hack its own game, or does it have to be written from the ground up? I don't want to have that conversation. I don't care, frankly, to be honest.
Okay, cool.
That being said, in PbtA space, I regularly bump into moves in one game that have clearly been informed by moves from another.
Sure.
Happens all the time. Someone has a great idea for a move. Be like, I want this to appear in my game. Slightly changed. With Firebrands, though, there's quite a bit of repetition with the minigames. And that figures because what is a minigame but a giant move? As the bakers had said. It's got an elaborate structure, but that elaborate structure makes it really easy to see in a different Firebrands hack, oh, you pulled this minigame from over there. And I found some minigames kept repeating across different games, more because they were evocative pieces of game design rather than on theme for the type of stories a particular game wanted to tell. The problem with these ill-fitting games, or games from my perspective as a player that don't make sense, is I'm never going to reach for them if they don't feel like they narratively make sense in the type of story you're telling. Maybe, for example, if you're looking at the minigames in Mobile Frame Zero Firebrands, and you see a game that's about violence, which makes sense with people in mechs fighting each other, but perhaps, just from a design perspective, it may not fit in with another setting, perhaps one that's set in the modern day, one that's set within a community in which you would normally not reach for the tools of violence. And the duel in particular is very evocative. It mirrors some of the mechanics of the dance and some of the mechanics of the stealing time mini games, but just because it's neat doesn't mean it necessarily has to be in your game. And maybe violence shouldn't be in that particular type of game.
Yeah.
Now, to spin this problem another way, remember this is me as a player looking at these mini game choices that designers have made. We can give this situation a charitable read because obviously these mini games must exist in a game because the designer felt that they fit the stories they envisioned for their game. But then for me personally, this makes it a really big metafictional challenge for me, the player, because now I need to figure out how the designer wants their genre to be portrayed in their game via their minigame choices. And maybe that's too much mental energy. So usually in these situations, I choose not to engage with those pages.
Yeah, that's a good choice. Rach, let's pretend.
Okay.
This is your first Firebrands game. What might make the process of getting into that first Firebrands game easier?
Important step is to adjust your expectations at the start of the game. Adjust your expectations of the type of game you're going to be sitting down to play and the type of characters you're going to explore and how deeply you're going to explore and the type of story that will come out of it. Firebrands is not necessarily going to give you a complex, layered story that will last through years of ongoing play. I hesitate to use this word because it's very loaded. I think it's safe to say that Firebrands is a more casual approach to tabletop role-playing games. The narrative's going to be very loose and dreamlike. Why is this pilot at a dance after their mecha was hanging off a cliff in the scene before? For example, that happened to me in the +1 forward home game. The answer I came to was anything is possible in a cutaway or solitaire, I guess. This means you as the player are going to have to think about why your character is in these scenes and be at peace that the connective tissue might not be as strong as it would be in other styles of games.
I think that's a fair reading.
What advice would you give for someone who's sitting down to their first Firebrands game, Rich?
Someone has just handed you a 32-page thing. It seems like, wow, I could read this in 15 minutes. It's 30 pages. This book is deceptively dense. You could pick up a mini game. It takes up 2, maybe 3 pages. Someone throws out the first question or challenge, and now you have to read and ponder dozens of possible responses. My recommendation is be patient. Be patient with everyone else. Be patient with yourself. Folks will need to read through the prompts. And that lag time can cause folks to get lost. By folks, I mean me. So I recommend rephrase the start and end points of an interaction after they've been completed before you proceed forward so that folks can follow what happened. Because I've seen it in my brief Firebrands experiences of someone saying, I do so-and-so thing. Feels like a 3-minute pause and someone throws back a response. And you can forget what they're responding to if you aren't on it or if you have a short attention span like I do. So be patient. For the first few mini games, and I would say probably for maybe your first session, pay attention even if you're not involved. Yes, there's solitaire, but there's a designated time for everyone to do solitaire, and I think that will suffice. Because if you are actively listening for as much as you can listen for character traits or character interactions or choices that interest you. And that way you can engage with that. You may only get snippets of a story because that does not appear to be the goal in this experience we're having together. But if you can at least reconstitute those things that you saw in a previous scene in a mini game that you participate in, there's some cohesion there that I've found to be pretty enjoyable. And also pay attention to the kind of interactions that folks are digging. Where does the table light up? What mood is everyone in? Look for the games that cater to that. Play into it, because I think you'll have a lot more fun that way.
I think that's great advice, especially with the making space and not overthinking the lag time. Because with Powered by the Apocalypse, we encourage listeners to go with the obvious choice. Mm-hmm. It's hard to go with the obvious choice when you have to read a paragraph of text.
Yeah. Yep.
And if you ask the question, it can also be anxiety-inducing, at least speaking for me as a player, to be like, they haven't answered my question.
Right.
Do they want to play with me?
Exactly. There were moments where like, oh, I asked the wrong question. They're too nice to say this was a bad idea. I should have asked this other question or challenge.
It's been a long summer. We've interviewed a lot of designers. We've played maybe not as many games as we set out to play this summer. But your highlight reel, what was the highlight of your Firebrands experience over these last few weeks?
During our recordings, I will say that the facilitation of the mini games was routinely really fun. I was delighted with Thy Words Inspire Thespians. I thought that Cole was just so energetic and interesting. Takuma's run of Stew Pot brought more out of that game than I got from reading it. Like, oh, I can see the fun here. That's really cool. I enjoyed that. In actual play, a high for me was the aforementioned play-by-post. So we took a mini game from a Firebrands game called Divine Mundane. In that, you play either as a mortal or a demigod or a god, and it leans into the Greek aspects of Greek pantheon, Greek mythology kind of stuff for the Divine Mundane break. But this game is a Urban Shadows game that has Greek mythology in it. So if it, and the mini game was called Ambrosia, which is the conversation over food from Mobile Frame Zero's original mini game. Tweaked it just a little bit. It's pretty cool. It's got toasts and exchanges. And I found that mini game and the structure and the options in Play by Post was really easy. I love that we could free play and that it was still ticking the clock towards a possible end game, but use that free play to lead into the parts of the game that were a next step, quote unquote, in the scene, and having a defined ending, knowing where that is and keeping that mental check going as we played was just great. This was my favorite single experience with a minigame, was doing it via play-by-post. I plan on incorporating more into the Heidi and Me Forever game, the Jules game. And in case you're curious, yes, in that meal, everyone left the table unhappy because that's how this game goes.
But intentionally unhappy.
Very, very awkwardly intentionally unhappy. Yes, it was great. What about you, Rach? What highs did you have from our series or from your experiences this summer?
I loved seeing all the different ways designers are working to solve the format complication with Firebrands. I don't want to say problem, but the complication. Firebrands is very much a pre-pandemic design in terms of its format. As written, it's got physical books that are passed out at a table, and this all acts as a tool to keep your players grounded in that shared gaming headspace. If you aren't on screen, you have something in your hands to fiddle with. You aren't going to necessarily reach for something else to play around with. You can flip ahead to other mini games that you could angle towards. You could flip back to solitaire. There's places you can go. You can read ahead. As we said, there's a lot of reading of Firebrands, so it doesn't hurt to skim and look at your future options. That doesn't intuitively lend itself well to online play. My favorite solution to this, we saw quite a few, but my favorite one was the Miro board for A Complicated Profession.
Oh gosh, yes, that was so cool.
Again, podcasts don't make for good video, but it was a beautiful board. It had all the mini games laid out in different places on it, so you could zoom in on the game you were currently playing. You could, again, look ahead. You could look back to your character information. You could look at everyone else's character information. It was great. It was the closest I've seen to simulating that flipping through the books aspect that would happen at Firebrands tables. I also enjoyed using PDFs on my phone while we were playing. Normally, I would encourage people to look at your phones, but using the PDF, I could flip ahead to other games and I could go to other sections. Some of the more complexly written games include discussions on setting and history. So if I wanted to go and see someone's media inspirations during downtime or look at a historical reference, I have that there to keep me back in the game as well.
Yeah, that's true. Well, let's move to lows, and I'll lead off with the honest answer of my low was scheduling. I honestly feel like if I'd gotten a few more Firebrands games to the table, I might have found a happier place to be with them. I was able to see the parts that I didn't love, but I only glimpsed the pieces of the really interesting design with my limited play.
Our scheduling was cursed. Content warning very briefly for COVID and the pandemic. I got COVID at the beginning of development of this summer series, so it was mucked up from the get-go.
Yeah.
I couldn't talk for 2 weeks. That aside, another low for me was the amount of time I found it took to get a game up and running online. It felt like the amount of time it took us to make characters, to flip through the mini games, to get acquainted with them, and then get started. By the time we were all done that, we only had time for one round of game selections. It's, again, admittedly been several years since I've run Firebrands games in person, but I seem to remember them being snappier in person and getting at least 2 rounds through, a little bit less back and forth. I'm not quite sure if that's just a quirk in how we're approaching these games and being a little bit more thoughtful for purposes of the summer series, or just, as we've discussed in other episodes on the podcast, doing online gaming sometimes takes different amounts of time.
I do think there might be some solutions in character keeper design that might facilitate online play easier. The Miro board approach that Jason used for A Complicated Profession was brilliant, and it felt like we jumped straight into that. So maybe that could help. But I agree. It was problematic. And in fact, in my first of the 2 face-to-facey games where I facilitated Thy Words Inspire, I showed up with the PDF and printouts of the solitaire stuff, as well as a little bit of the setup, but I didn't want to print out 40 pages 5 times. It's a lot of paper. My wife gets mad when I use up all her paper and her ink. And so I thought, I'll just do this, and then I'll have the Chromebook. And it took a little bit for us to get things situated with how to do it in a live space without everyone having their own booklet. We had 2 people looking over one laptop and one person looking over the Chromebook and another person looking on their phone. And by the second time around, when we played Superstars Racing Icons, we had it down pat. We knew what we needed, but that first time was pretty awkward, and I felt really guilty, and I felt like a cheapskate.
Whenever we've played them in person, my partner made cute little books, but that was something he did, where he got glossy paper for the covers or colored paper.
Oh, nice.
But that was oftentimes a gift from him to me for running these games. Your mileage may vary.
Well, Rach, we have completed our 3rd summer series, and unless something crops up out of nowhere, there are no major design generations out there from PbtA. There was Forged in the Dark, Belonging Outside Belonging, and Firebrands. So I think this might be our last summer series.
I am curious and excited to see what spin-offs of Powered by the Apocalypse speak to the designing base next. I think it's completely unpredictable to figure out which one's going to be the next one to grab people's attention. Is it going to be Wolfspell? Is it going to be Apocalypse Keys?
Under Hollow Hills.
Oh, that's another good one.
Yeah. I do think Apocalypse Keys, the Between, Apocalypse Keys, Brindlewood Bay, those all seem to be of a flavor of PbtA. That's interesting.
Yeah. And once again, thank you for coming along with me on this journey to look at a subsection of Powered by the Apocalypse over our latest summer.
Thank you for guiding me through it, Rach. And thanks everybody for listening.
Plus One Forward is a production of the Gauntlet community, Richard Rogers and Rach Shelkey. You can find us at gauntlet-rpg.com or follow us on Twitter at +1FWD. If you would like to support our show, visit our Patreon site at patreon.com/gauntlet. The games mentioned on this show use the Apocalypse engine, which is a creation of Vincent and Magay Baker. The music for Plus One Forward is from the Savage Aural Hotbed CD Gomi Daiko. The songs used are Gomi Daiko, Metal Version, and Drowning Attitude. You can find more amazing tunes by Savage Aural Hotbed on their website, www.savageauralhotbed.com.
Listeners, we want to let you know that Hearts of Wulin, our PbtA game of wuxia melodrama, is now available as a PDF on DriveThru RPG. Hearts of Wulin emulates films like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon and Shadow, and TV series like The Untamed and Ancient Detective. It is inspired by the Chinese martial arts novels of Jin Yong and Gu Long and their many adaptations. In these tales, romance is as dangerous as a blade. You can buy Hearts of Wulin at the Gauntlet store on DriveThruRPG. You can find more information and resources for it on our Gauntlet blog, on the Gauntlet webpage at gauntlet-rpg.com.